Hi all, thanks for watching this video. Today we're going to talk about a part of English grammar that is really complicated, which is our system of articles. Definite, indefinite, and the quote-unquote zero article. This won't be just a review of the typical rules you've learned about these, because the whole point here is to actually deepen our knowledge and our accuracy with these articles, well beyond those rules we learned in school. Because oftentimes, especially in academic writing, those rules about articles just don't serve our purposes well enough. So let's get into it. By the way, for the rest of this video, I'm going to be relying pretty heavily on the two references I list here. And if you want a really good grammar resource on this topic, I highly recommend you buy this book, The Longman Student Grammar. First, let's consider the following. In your first language or first languages, do articles exist at all? Is there an indefinite one like a or an, as well as a definite one like the? Does this idea of definiteness even exist in your first language? And related questions. How is singular and plural expressed in your first language? Also, does the idea of uncountability exist? Your answers to these questions might be a really good indicator of how many problems you have choosing the correct article. English is rather unique in its system of articles, and especially on two aspects, countability and definiteness, which we're going to talk much more about. Many second language writers of English run into problems where their first language's use of articles doesn't match their use in English, and so the bigger the differences, the more problems we might expect. For example, in Russian, Korean, or Turkish, there are essentially no articles that work like English articles, so those coming from these language backgrounds tend to have more problems than someone who, for example, speaks Spanish, German, or Dutch as a first language, where the differences are smaller. Still, even they run into problems. For example, we might say the science in Spanish, but just science in English. Or informations in German, but only the uncountable information in English. Another reason articles cause problems is that they don't necessarily make a big impact on the meaning of something. They're not likely to be the reason someone doesn't understand what you're saying or writing. And this has led most English language learners to reach a certain plateau with their understanding of English articles, and then to feel like further improvements aren't really worth the work it would take to understand the rules any better. I say this also as a writing instructor, because I've often given the cop-out answer to writers that even though they're making mistakes with articles, that it would be too complex to really improve systematically, and so the best approach is just to not worry too much and hope for the best. But this is wrong because, number one, articles do matter, not for understanding the meaning, but rather for signaling that the writer has a mastery over the language, and therefore probably has a mastery over the content they're writing about also. Now, this is not a fair assumption, but it's an unconscious one. And two, it's wrong because you absolutely can improve your use of articles. But why is this so difficult? Well, the way native speakers acquire this weird and wonderful system that is articles, and determiners in general in English, is never taught. It's just acquired naturally, and so it's totally mysterious to native speakers themselves. Some researchers have called this a psychomechanism more than a learning process. This means that not only are native speakers really bad at explaining and teaching the guidelines by which one article versus another is chosen, but also that they have an extremely developed and totally intuitive awareness of articles, which makes them very sensitive to mistakes. Now, if you're trying to sound like a 100% native speaker in your writing with your use of articles, prepare to fail. Unless you develop this sense of intuition about articles, you'll never get there. But that's okay. The goal is not to sound like a native speaker, but to sound proficient and masterful. And you can totally reach that goal. But unlike native speakers, to do this, we're going to have to look more closely at the rules, or rather the guidelines, for using articles in English. So in general, we can think of our decision-making process for nouns as looking something like this. And by the way, we're only talking about nouns today because, of course, articles only go with nouns. First, we have to decide whether the noun we're using is countable or uncountable. And if it's countable, is it singular or plural? Now, countability means, basically, whether a noun can be counted in number. In other words, I can't say 2 informations, but I can say 2 cups of coffee. Even though this sounds simple, in English, we love to make it hard. And so we're going to look more closely at this idea of countability in a moment. Singular and plural, of course, is a little more straightforward most of the time. Next, we need to decide whether the noun is definite or not. And definiteness usually means, in essence, whether the noun is already known or specified to the reader. But just like countability, this sounds a lot more straightforward than it is. So we're going to unpack this too. Now, the questions of whether something is definite and whether it is countable overlap quite a bit. Let's start with the slightly easier decision of the two that we have to make, whether our noun is countable or uncountable. And if it's countable, should it be singular or plural? We know that we can only use a or an when talking about something that is both countable and singular. Well, we'll see some exceptions in a moment. So in many cases, the question we're unsure about is whether we should use an or the zero article. This comes down to the question of when something is countable. It's really important to point out that this binary idea of something being either countable or uncountable is a little bit simplistic, and that's important because it's the source of a lot of our problems. Some suggest there are as many as 8 levels of countability in English, but we don't need to go that deep. It's better to think of a noun as existing on a spectrum of countability, going from never countable to always countable. And each noun has a different place on the spectrum. Suffice it to say that a few nouns are simply never countable, mainly just a few, like information, while others fall into the category of rarely countable, such as personal traits like creativity, or other similarly intangible things like wisdom. And then a lot of other nouns could be countable or uncountable, depending on their meaning and context. And then, of course, we have the nouns that are basically always countable. For example, units of things like kilometers, or obviously individual items like jars of marmalade or cups of tea. So, of course, relatively speaking, we don't have too many problems with things at the far ends of that spectrum, the things that we wouldn't think to count anyway, like courage, or on the other hand, the things that are always countable, like jars of marmalade. Nope, it's the stuff in the middle that causes problems. The stuff that could be countable or uncountable depending on our meaning. So let's look at some of these examples. He drinks coffee all afternoon versus he just ordered a coffee for you as well. I'm a good employee because I have a lot of experience versus I had a memorable experience at the elephant preserve. For most, friendship is considered an important part of social life versus few people can claim to have a friendship that has lasted 50 years. You can see from these examples that the idea of countability is signaled by our grammar choice here, but it also tells the reader something particular about how the noun should be understood. In other words, its meaning. So while it's unrealistic to say that the average reader wouldn't be able to figure out what we mean if we make a mistake, it's also unrealistic to say that there's zero impact from the article choices we make, or indeed if we make an error. On the other hand, remember that as the writer, you don't have just one correct choice most of the time, but rather that your options also exist on a spectrum, from totally what anyone would expect on one side to that sounds totally wrong on the other side. So in many cases, there's more than one perfectly good option. Now that we've got a good starting idea of countability, let's talk more about definiteness. Definiteness is typically marked in English with that tricky little word the. First, we're going to look at the situations that best fit with those rules we already learned in high school or elementary school, but we'll use some slightly more grown-up terms for them. The first reason to use the is called the anaphoric use. Basically, that means when something is already known to us, and so the goes with an entity that's already known or specified. For example, an experimental test was performed to determine the average velocity. The test was then validated by X. The next typical reason to use the is indirect anaphoric use. In other words, it is indirectly already known to us. And this is when we're referring to something that is at least associated with an already known entity. For example, the driver's car showed evidence of a head-on collision. The front bumper was completely crumpled, and the concrete highway barricade also had deep scratches in it. The VW Golf is considered totaled. Here you'll notice that none of those noun phrases had a specific anaphoric reference. However, we can understand from context that we're still talking about the driver's car and what happened during the collision. Next is the so-called cataphoric use of the. That means when something is about to be known or specified by us, generally in the same phrase or sentence. For example, the preliminary results of a small sample study reveal the parents of a young boy in Bochum were questioned today. While we do not yet know the details, a new law regarding X has... Next, we have a few uses of the definite article that are more important when we're speaking than when we're writing formally. We have situational uses of the, and that's often in conversation, when referring to an entity that can be known from the situation, whether that's physical or the broader situation. Now, since we're not in the room with a reader when we're talking to them, we don't share much common knowledge with them, and that's why these are more common in conversation. But they are definite because the listener would know what they refer to from the situation. For example, what do you think about the big news? Hang on, there's someone at the door. Will you get those dishes off the shelf? And finally, we have a lot of standard expressions in English, whether these are idioms or just typical collocations and traditions. This includes a lot of cultural conventions that don't really have logical reasons either, so don't overthink these too much. But we also just kind of have to memorize them. For example, why do we say the Amazon River but not the Mount Everest? And because they're not logical, you can't really easily modify these. For example, we cannot say long and short of it is that we can't pay. And we can't say on a hole or early birds get worms. These are fixed expressions. So we really only modify them for some particular reason, like we're making a joke. Now, the rules we've just talked about basically govern our decision about when something is indefinite versus definite. In other words, when to use the indefinite article a or an versus the definite article the. But let's get to the real trouble with the question of definiteness. And this again goes back to the question of countability too, where a lot of nouns hang out in the middle of the spectrum where they might be countable and they might not. So let's look at some examples of nouns that might be used in a real, specific, tangible sense. And therefore, our regular rules for countable nouns would apply in terms of whether or not we're going to use definite or indefinite articles. Or they might be used in a more abstract sense, and therefore we would use our zero article. The university is located 45 kilometers away in Hildesheim, versus I attended university in 4 different cities. We ate a cold, quiet lunch out on the terrace, versus you should join us for lunch one day soon. The basketball bounced off the hoop and she scored no points, versus this is because she isn't very good at basketball. They will take the train to Lisbon, versus they will travel by train to Lisbon. And speaking of using the zero article with these nouns that are not real, specific, intangible, let's dig deeper into this idea of intangible nouns that go with the zero article. We use the zero article when referring to so-called cultural institutions and generic experiences, and these are usually the most traditional parts of life. For example, hospital, jail, church, school, along with life phases such as childhood, old age, adolescence, etc. We also use the zero article when referring to intangible feelings, conditions, or situations, such as love, sadness, joy, cancer, etc. Now, in comparison, we use the definite article the when referring to other standard or generic places, quote, when nearness or association to the reader or the writer is assumed. For example, the office, the gym, the store, the doctor, the mall, etc. And as we already said, most of these nouns hang out in the middle of the definite and countable spectrum, where they might be abstract and uncountable sometimes, and other times they might refer to their more specific, tangible versions. So let's be a little more specific about some typical situations for this. First, we've seen that we use an article when we want to add a certain tangibility to nouns that wouldn't otherwise require an article if we were talking about their more generic or intangible versions. For example, when speaking generically, we might say, pregnancy can be a joyful time for new parents, versus, the pregnancy has been difficult for her, or it is common for a pregnancy to have complications. When speaking generically, we might say, statistical analysis is the process by which blah, 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 versus the statistical analysis was performed using SPSS. And secondly, in some situations, we might treat a noun that's usually uncountable as something countable and or definite when we want to give it a so-called boundary edge. When we do this, it means generally that we're setting the noun apart from some other version of that noun. And then we've turned the noun into an ordinary countable one, so all the typical rules for countable nouns apply. For example, when speaking in general, we might say, the beam is made of steel, versus a triple forged steel was developed by, or we might say, love is an unstoppable force, versus the love that a mother has for her child is powerful. Now, we've seen this word generic several times, and it's an important concept when deciding which article to use in our formal writing. To say that something is generic basically means that it's not specific to any particular entity, but is a statement of a more universal context. And in academic writing, we use this all the time when stating facts, explaining things, or speaking generally. Technically, we have three options, but they're not all equal in meaning, so let's take a closer look. First, with the indefinite article, we can give a meaning similar to a typical representation of the noun we're talking about. For example, a table is a piece of furniture with a flat top. A scanning electron microscope is far more powerful than a traditional microscope. A reader's attention level is partly dependent on a text's readability. Next, we can use the zero article along with plural nouns to mean speaking about the entirety of a group of that noun. For example, tardigrades are microscopic and extremely hardy animals. People say that Russians make the best ballet dancers. And finally, we can use the definite article along with a singular noun if we want to say the universal and generic notion of that noun I'm talking about. For example, the Chihuahua is a noble breed of dog. The microscope fundamentally changed our understanding of biology. The writer is generally considered responsible for making the text more readable. One more brief note, because a lot of writers ask me how to write captions for figures or titles or similar things. For that, we use block language. Block language essentially just works by deleting all articles, but don't confuse it with using the zero article, because that has its own rules. But we often use block language in our writing, such as, figure indicates recent trend in inflation. Summit unsuccessful, says head of development. So, in summary, let's go back to our decision-making process, which mainly asks two questions. First, we have to decide whether the noun we're using is countable or uncountable, and if it's countable, is it singular or plural? To determine this, we have to think about notions like whether we mean a real, tangible entity, which is usually countable, or a more abstract, intangible idea of the entity, which is often uncountable. For example, going to university versus going to a university. Singular and plural is, of course, a little more straightforward most of the time, except when we're speaking generically. Next, we need to decide whether the noun is definite or not, and that usually means whether it's already known to the reader or not. In addition to the essential rules we learned in school, like what to do the first time versus the second time we refer to something, we also need to, again, consider notions of tangible versus intangible and generic versus particular, and indeed, what kind of generic reference we're making. And all of this impacts our idea of countable, uncountable too, since remember that we always have three options: the indefinite article, the definite article, and the zero article, and each one can signal something different about the noun. So in short, you can definitely see why this has caused English language learners a lot of problems, but also remember that you have an intuitive sense for this already. The more you pay attention to precise article usage in English, the kind found in well-written texts, for example, the better your intuitive sense will become. So try to ask yourself what the writer is signaling with a particular article choice and how it might be different in your first language. And here's a little bit of practice that we can use to ask ourselves these questions about articles and hopefully spot some errors. In the short paragraph you see here, you can find 5 certain errors in this text. I say 5 certain errors because there is some amount of context that we really can't understand here and that the writer must decide for herself. But there are definitely at least 5 problems with articles in this paragraph. Can you find them? Go ahead and pause before I share the answer. So, how'd you do? So, some final points to make. We need to manage our expectations when it comes to improving our articles and understanding how big of a deal this really is. Keep in mind that these mistakes with articles rarely interfere with understanding the actual meaning of your text. They're usually just distracting. In other words, they are local but not usually global errors. But I know that's frustrating because if you're writing your dissertation in English especially, that implies that your language is already really, really good. So it can be super annoying to feel like you just can't get this part right. Remember though, your goal isn't to sound native, but rather to sound proficient and masterful. To get it within the margin of error, so to speak. So give yourself a break. Because this is indeed weirdly complicated in English, and there's no good explanation for that other than the fact that we're pretty obsessed with being able to express these really fine distinctions in meaning and being super precise. So the goal is really to minimize distractions for the readers, and the fewer distractions, the more the text will flow. And I also want to emphasize that you absolutely can improve this. Your brain is capable of so much more subtle understanding than you realize. So even if articles don't exist whatsoever in your first language, you can absolutely become a masterful user of English articles. So I hope this extremely deep dive into articles has been helpful for you. And thanks for watching this video. Please be sure to add any comments or questions you have onto the YouTube or also in our group Padlet.